Good morning. Welcome, everyone. My name is Andrew Sobanay. I'm a professor of French and Francophone Studies and Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs in the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm delighted to be here with you today. And we're delighted to welcome our guest of honor among many distinguished invitees and many supporters of our Persian Studies program, including Leila Sheikh-ul-Islami and Sharzad Jalinous, who are with us here today. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Abbas Amanat, who is the William Graham Summer Professor of History Emeritus at Yale University. Since 1983, he taught at Yale the history of early modern Iran, Shi'ism, modern Middle East, and the Persianate world. He is the author of 8 books, most recently Iran, A Modern History, published at Yale in 2017. He's edited and co-edited 13 volumes and published a number of articles in a number of distinguished venues. He served as the chair of the Yale Council on Middle East Studies and as the director of the Yale Program in Iranian Studies. He was also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Iranian Studies and is the editor-in-chief of the forthcoming series on sources for the study of the Persianate world. He lives in North Haven, Connecticut, and in Santa Monica, California. So we're delighted to have everyone here today, and we'd also like to thank everyone who made this event possible, especially Dr. Farima Mostofi, who is the director of our Persian Studies program, Sarah Lynn Neger, who is our extremely efficient and loyal staff person who organized the event, and also a number of our student volunteers who are here today. So thank you all, and thank you for all of our very enthusiastic friends of the Persian Studies program. It's really a pleasure to be here, and we hope to maintain our momentum in this arena for many years to come. So Dr. Amanat, it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. The title of your talk is? Making of Militant Mullahs, a journey from the Madrasa to the Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Well, let me start by thanking Dean Sobani and the organizers of this program, that I've been the third speaker, the third year. I would appreciate the activities that I can see is going on with reference to Iranian studies at Georgetown, particularly Dr. Farima Mostofi, who has been active and very successful, as I have noticed over the past 3-4 days in the seminars that she had organized, and I've noticed the enthusiasm of the students, more than 22 or 25 of them that attended the seminars, and did not expect to see that much of an enthusiasm and interest. And of course, noticing that many of them speak a very good Persian. And for whatever for the amount that, the number of years that they have studied it. So that's a very welcoming move, and I very much hope that the initiative that has been started by Ms. Sheikh-ul-Islami and Ms. Badmangalich and Ms. Jalinous would eventually result in the creation of a position, full-time position in the Department of History. As I've just heard a moment ago, apparently there is a very interesting response from the Department of History, very supportive, and I hope that this would soon result in an appointment in a university that plays a very major part in the shaping of future diplomats, future politicians in this country and abroad. This is a very famous program. Georgetown program is one of the flagships of this university, and indeed nationally. And as such, I think the presence of a number of Iranians or specialists of Iran would be very welcome. I am also very happy to see that Dr. Nader Hashemi has also joined Georgetown, and that is also a very important, I think, development. I'm also delighted to see Dr. Opwitz, whom I've known since her Yale's time, and I was delighted to see that she's also in a position of great significance in the future of Middle East studies in this university. Not only I would like to thank the organizers, Dr. Mostofi, as I pointed out, but also Daniel, who has been very active. I don't know whether he's, oh, there he is, okay. In basically helping me to put through, and also a number of other people who had been very supportive during the past few days that I've been here. Okay, the title, as I have just announced, the making of Militant Mullahs, a journey from the Madrasa to the Islamic Revolution. I should start by pointing out that I did not intend any kind of a derogatory intent or derogatory subtext in the choice of the topic. Mullahs these days probably are degraded to the lower degrees of the hierarchy within the establishment, within the religious establishment. Whereas if you would look back probably a century or less than a century earlier, you would see that majority of them were indeed referred to as mullahs. And this was a common title, very much honored for learned people, as the distinction of the term. And therefore, referring to the mullahs, it seems to me, does not necessarily means that you are degrading the people who are engaged in the field of religious studies, in traditional madrasa religious studies. And the term, of course, militant, that I have also chosen for the topic, has a great currency in today's Iran. As a matter of fact, there are two groups, Rohaniyun Mubares, as they call themselves, and Rohaniyat Mubares. These are two different groups. Mubares for militant. And this is the term that was widely used in the years prior to the Islamic Revolution and throughout. Although today it has lost some of its luster, but nevertheless, still, I think, majority of the activist, clerical members of the clergy still consider themselves as militant or revolutionary. Therefore, for a historian, a major question is how this process evolved when we had basically a community of largely, one might say, quietist and cooperative with the university, with the establishment, with the state, supportive of the state for a very long time, in a sense, basically followers of the old arrangement or old understanding that goes back really to Sasanian times, that the religious establishment and the state are two sisters. دو خواهر همزاد in Persian, as you look back in the 6th century text of Name Tansar, which is one of the books of the mirrors that presumably were produced at the time of Khosrow I, at the latter part of the 5th century, beginning of the 6th century, and was then translated into Arabic and eventually into Persian. The term was very much accepted and was a source of a loyalty of majority of the members of the clergy throughout the time. Well, there were for quite a while a kind of what you might call to it as a turf war. I'm sorry to use this term, but makes very much sense. Let me get some water. in the sense that they consider themselves really as in a position of support for the state, and as they often refer to as basically praying for the survival of the state. Du'aguye dolat, that's the term that you would find in many of the accounts of the religious dignitaries throughout the course of 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. If you read some of their works, and you would see usually the first page is the acknowledgement for the patronage of the state, and this idea of supplication for the continuity of the state. So the question is, and that's, I think, is a question that for the past 40 years preoccupied many who have been involved in the development and the emergence of the more militant religious establishment in the latter part of the 20th century. Why and how this process took place? How these quietist, cooperative supporters of the state that were involved in a number of engagements over the course of time on issues of policy, on issues of vested interest with the state, but never ever questioned the legitimacy of the state. I yet to see a single piece of evidence that would show us historically that any religious figure would question whether within the Safavid period, at least as early as the 16th century, up for one or two exceptions, all the way up to the first part of the 20th century. There's not such a thing. It's always been supportive. They've always legitimized the state rather than questioning its legitimacy in power. So, as I said, it's a great subject for historians to try forever to debate what happened. And this is one attempt among many. I chose this topic partly because of the fact that I thought it may have some relevance to a university such as Georgetown. So my university, Yale, and Georgetown, both of them are institutions that started in the 18th century. Yale, the beginning of the 18th century. Georgetown, coinciding with the American Revolution, 1786, I believe, or 87, 89. Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, okay, that's right, the French Revolution. And both of them started as, in a sense, Christian institutions. Yale started as a seminary, as it was called actually, a Connecticut seminary, with a kind of a Puritanist Protestant kind of loyalties, and Georgetown as again a university that has its origins in the Christian movement towards education and so forth. So both of them are very good examples of how institutions could start in a religious footing, but move away to try to acknowledge and appreciate and receive the secular curriculum as it happened in both cases. Both universities gradually shifted toward a program of secular education. That's what we witness today. So what happened in the world of Shi'i Islam in Iran that such a move did not take place? Or at least I claim that it hasn't happened. Why the madrasas of Iran and southern Iraq, that is in Najaf in particular, also in Karbala, but mostly in Najaf, these schools remained pretty much conservative in their support and development of a very rigid, I would say, curriculum of education that they inherited from the Middle Ages and remained loyal to it. If you look at many of the titles that were studied in the course of 20th century and up to today, you would see that these are the texts from the medieval times that were studied with great rigor, but nevertheless, somewhat it seems to be distant from the realities of religious education or religious needs of the society in the 20th century, let alone a secular society that we are witnessing. And that is one of the major features that, as a matter of fact, the madrasa, the Shi'i Madrasa, never fully acknowledged and embraced a secular perspective, but always remained kind of a very diligently supportive of its own program of education and its own, as a matter of fact, way of dealing with the society through the judicial courts that became very important in the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Such a historical development would bring me back. There are very many ways that one can interpret this, but one way, from the perspective of historians, to look back at the origins, what really happened. In the early part of the 18th century, the collapse of the Safavid Empire, in effect, removed from the religious establishment the patronage, the support that they had received very extensively under the Safavids. So from 1722 all the way up to the end of the 18th century, these religious figures, as a matter of fact, were orphaned as far as the support of the state was concerned. And many of them, as a matter of fact, either because of the Afghan invasion of Iran and the other developments later on under the Nadir Shah and beyond, had a very low profile. Many of them actually took refuge in the madrasas of the southern Iraq when there was a more sympathetic government of the Mamluks of Iraq in power. So what happened in this period, in the late 18th century and probably early years of the 20th century, early years of the 19th century, is that a new school of legal school emerged that is referred to as usulis. That is a term that was adopted from the term usul al-fiqh, the roots of jurisprudence, which meant that there was a greater emphasis on the methodology of how to study the law and what are the sources that law can provide the law in order to implement new opinions. That is the Usuli school that we see up to today, as a matter of fact, is the dominant interpretation of law within the religious establishment. What that means in reality is that the emergence of the Usuli school allowed many of these clerical figures to move out of the madrasa and become figures in the social life of the community. They established courts, that is religious courts, that gave them a great degree of a presence in the society. They, as part of the Usuli theory, the idea of ijtihad, or the issuing of opinions for the affairs of the society, was revived. Not that it was not present, but it was revived in the 19th century, in the late 18th century and early 19th century. The idea that ijtihad requires the followers, or those who would adhere to the opinions of a certain doctor of law or a jurist, which is usually referred to as the mujtahid, the one who exercises ijtihad. And the mujtahids became far more significant in the early part of the 19th century. They, in effect, managed to fill out the vacancies in many of the cities of Iran that, because of the interregnum between the fall of the Safavids and the rise of the Qajars in the very late 18th century and early 19th century, allowed them to appear in particularly major cities such as Isfahan, Yazd, Qazvin, Kashan. these were all major centers of Shiism that again gained a greater presence of the religious establishment, now in a much more visible position than what it was even under the Safavids. There are several institutions that they were able to almost monopolize. First of all, the judiciary became almost their territory, although there was a kind of an understanding with the state that certain aspects of the law is going to be exercised by the state, and the civil law and aspects of basically devotional acts became the constituency of the religious establishment. And they very vigorously convinced the population that they are basically have to follow the opinions of the mujtahids. This is the feature that continues throughout the course of the 19th century up to the early part of the 20th century. I don't spend too much time on those aspects because our time is limited and I have to come closer to the more recent times. But there is one aspect which is particularly important, and that is the fact that by the time of the constitutional revolution in the early part of the 20th century, constitutional revolution normally is defined as a period between 1905 or 1906 and 1911, sometimes by extension to 1921 and the rise of the Pahlavi state. During this time period, there was a particular demand on one of the most important patrons of the religious establishment, that these were the merchants and the basically the artisans of the bazaar, who were the great followers of the religious establishment and put a great amount of their income through this religious, through the mercantile community. So mercantile community more and more felt at the turn of the 20th century that they have to make the religious establishment more responsive, not only to the issues of devotional acts and very intricate details in which they had produced huge number of works in the course of the 19th century. And actually it's quite a remarkable body of work when it comes to the details, as they would refer to as furu'e din. They were fairly extensively supporting or covering that area. But the questions in the minds of many of their patrons, religious, mercantile patrons, were different. They had difficulty dealing with the state and complaining about the excesses of the state in the early 20th century. They were also complaining about the interference from the foreign competition in issues of trade and particularly in monopolies. As such, the religious establishment virtually was forced to come into dealings with the more significant issues that they considered up to then as secondary issues. Umur Sanawiye. They were not interested in the affairs of the government. They were not interested in issues such as political move towards greater creation of a system, a constitutional system. They were not interested. So from the late 19th century, in the earlier stages, they are fairly successful. Most significant example of that is the Regime protest that was staged as the general populace, but more significantly the merchants of tobacco, viewed the interference of monopolizing by a British company as an interference in their trade. And the religious establishment supported them, partly in Iran, partly in southern Iraq, and they successfully managed to bring about the end of the regime and, in a sense, a victory for the religious establishment. But from there on, that's the interesting feature. We see that the clerical establishment is not ready to handle the issues of modern times. In a sense, they resisted modernity throughout the course of the 19th century and insisted on their own interpretation of the law, and therefore have not been ready to deal with the problems of a society that was in search of a more codified and more, in a sense, emergence of a constitutional regime. Throughout the 19th century, several attempts that made by the state to codify law was rejected. And as you know, the Shi'i religion, contrary to the Sunni Islam of at least the Ottoman world, never accepted the idea of a codified law. So from one mujtahid to the other, there are different interpretations. And this indeed, in practice, was the case all the way up to the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Now, of course, it's a very different circumstances. But up to then, you would see that this kind of a resistance made them incapable of dealing with the issues of constitutionalism, plural state, creation of a more democratic, more representative society, a more representative political community. And as such, by the end of the constitutional period, I don't go too much into the details, but we'll see that the religious establishment, despite its great presence in the early stages of the constitution, is basically isolated. And virtually by 1920s was forced back to the madrasa. There is almost a desire on the side of the secular state, that's the early Pahlavi state, to try to push them out of the system, and that happens. As a result of that, we see the new emergence of a new religious establishment in the madrasas who have lost all their privileges, earlier privileges. Most significant of all, the judicial system that now comes under a secular state establishment under the Pahlavi. They basically lose, or the religious courts are abandoned, and a great exodus takes place from the upper echelons of the religious establishment into the Pahlavi state. They change their clothing. They are no longer turbaned and in the classical appearance of the mullahs, but are what they would refer to as mukalla, those who wear hats, or fokoli, those who wear ties. And they are in the service of the government, most of them as judges in the secular system. And as a matter of fact, the early Pahlavi regime managed to successfully adopt a European code of law, perhaps Napoleonic code, into a Shi'i system fairly successfully. If you read the account of the civil law or criminal law of the Pahlavi period, you see that the influence of Shi'i fiqh is very much present. Shi'i jurisprudence is very much present. The exodus meant the greater degree of intellectual poverty within the religious establishment. We also see that they lose the equally important educational monopoly. Madrasa, with its scholastic system of education, is no longer a major relevance to the life of the Pahlavi era. The public schools that emerges under the system, under the new system, basically creates a new class of the new middle classes with the secular perspective that thrive and become very significant in the development of both social and political in the later decades. The religious establishment sulks and begrudges that what had happened to it. They lost also the control of the endowments, not entirely, but in a sense, state regulated the income from the religious endowments, and they became basically pensioners. Majority of them became pensioners. As a result of that, there was also a loss in that area. All of this, among the others, they lost the constituencies in the mosques as well, as more and more means of communication emerges: radio, cinema, theaters, new publications of books, secular titles, newspapers. All of these, in effect, weakens the presence of a religious discourse or a religious program in the general public. And as such, there's some degree of weaknesses also visible in that area. Beyond that, what we witness is that there is the period witnesses in kind of a shortcoming or failure, in effect, to modernize. Issues of secular modernity that is so prominent in the Pahlavi period, particularly the early Pahlavi period, has very little impact on the shaping of the ideology of the religious establishment. We don't hear them talking about modern values, such as, for instance, equality before the law, the status of the women, the question of tolerance towards all members of the society. These are the issues that they adamantly resist, or there are trends that starts to think about these issues, but usually they are in minority and they lose their significance. That substantive force that keeps this kind of a religious establishment together, still it's that aspect of jurists' attention to the devotional acts and to the civil law in the way that it was practiced in the 19th century. There is very little way of innovation. Actually, it's very significant to notice that the idea of innovation, bid'at, was completely rejected. So in a sense, the very idea of change, that request for a change by time, demand for a change by time, is no longer visible within the religious community. The idea even of expediency, the idea that the society evolves and therefore it needs new approach to law, was also in effect was never fully developed. They remained fairly irresponsive to that aspect. Instead, in search of recovery for a new social relevance in the society, we see that from the middle of the century, middle of the 20th century, particularly from the 1960s onwards, a desire to basically bypass legal modernity and move in the direction of a political activism. And political activism, particularly on a kind of a radical agenda. So what we see, the emergence of militant members of the clergy, not majority, a minority, but gradually it was a very powerful and influential minority, of which Ruhollah Khomeini is a very good example. He basically lives through, he was born in 1900, and he witnessed basically this demotion of the religious establishment and responded to it by moving not in the direction of creating a more democratic and tolerant system on a modern basis, but in the direction of, in a sense, activism and radical activism that questions the very legitimacy of the state, That's for the first time that we witnessed that. By the 1970s, first by the 1960s, during a very famous 1963 riots that basically made the relations between the religious establishment or certain parts of the religious establishment and the state in a period of crisis. But certainly by 1970s, it has been incorporated into a theory of government that is referred to as Hukumat Islami. That's the title of that composite that was put together by Ayatollah Khomeini as a kind of a prescription for the creation of an Islamic state. So the very emphasis on the Islamic means that the secular state in power was viewed by the religious establishment as illegitimate, and therefore the emergence of a more Islamic form, very much influenced by the trends in the Sunni world, very much influenced by the trends that was earlier on in the 1950s. We can see in the society of the Fadayan Islam, the devotees to Islam. It's a terrorist organization, very, very active in the 1940s and 50s. And much of that agenda was transferred to the new ideology, new left, new radical ideology of the religious establishment. But that wasn't sufficient. What we witnessed in the 1970s, more and more absorbing the rhetoric of the left, secular left, that becomes part and parcel of the ideology of radical wing of the religious establishment, particularly in Qom, you would see, and more or less under the supervision of Ayatollah Khomeini, whether he was in Tehran or he was in exile in Najaf. Whether he was in Qom or in exile in Najaf. What we witness is that through some intermediaries, particularly people like Jalal al-Ahmad, these are intellectuals with the leanings towards with sympathies towards religious establishment, and Ali Shariati, even more significant, in basically making available these revolutionary rhetoric to the religious establishment, to some wing of religious establishment. If you look at the writings of the period, among not only Ayatollah Khomeini, but many of his students, gradually absorbing these aspects of either radical Islamic ideologies, mostly from Muslim Brothers in Egypt, and some of the works that was translated into Persian and made available already in Arabic by the members of the clergy, many of the students of Khomeini, or as you can see, many ideas that comes through the anti-Westernism or the revolutionary Shi'ism. Both of them are aspects that were advocated, the first one by al-Ahmad, the second one by Ali Shariati, and becomes part and parcel of what the religious establishment needed in order to make itself more relevant once it has lost all those old privileges during the period of isolation under the Pahlavis. So they make a second coming out of the madrasa, again to the society, but with a very different agenda, with a much more forceful agenda of completely delegitimizing the state. And as a matter of not only that, but managing to basically isolate the liberal opposition to the Pahlavi rule. You would see that by the 1980s, basically the liberal nationalists, either in the remnant of the National Front of the Mossadegh era, or other individuals that had agendas for the creation of a more liberal plural society, basically were isolated. And the voice of the religious establishment becomes much more appealing. Why it was appealing, that's the last point I would like to make, is the fact that there was an aura of sanctity of that particularly is visible with Khomeini. After 50 years of secularization of Iranian society, now this kind of almost a messianic figure emerges who is completely out of this, outside the discourse of secularism. He is a figure that appeals both to the secular population of Iran, but also to those who remained loyal to the religious establishment in the bazaar, in the lower echelons of the Iranian, lower sectors of the Iranian society. And as such, he has, through the mosques, through his network, and the growing network, as more and more people more and more members of the clergy are joining the radical interpretation of law in the direction of a revolution. Of course, I'm not here talking about the fact that how the revolution happened. That's a very complex picture. There's lots of ideas, lots of trends, lots of happenings that brings about the revolution. But their place, in a sense, was strengthened all the way up to the early part of the revolution, after 1979. They become even more visible, more popular for a time period. But the problem with the religious establishment remains one thing. Although they have this radical agenda, although they manage to return back to the make themselves relevant, they are incapable of addressing the questions of modernity in the Iranian society as a whole. So that is the major kind of paradox. On the one hand, popular, great support. On the other hand, incapable of, in a sense, bringing about major changes in terms of the reinterpreting the Sharia, reinterpreting the Islamic law as they have learned and practiced in the madrasa. They made some attempts, that should be said. They acknowledged the idea of expediency, maslaha, and the fact that the society is in need of, that the law is in need of dealing with the issues of the society and try to adjust itself to the needs of the society. But as there is a lagging distance between where the society goes and how the religious establishment responds to it. And it's, I think, as a result of that, what we witness today is that basically the failure of the religious establishment to give answers to the issues of majority of the people in Iranian society, particularly those secularized sectors of the society that, despite the presence of the Islamic Republic ever since 1980 onwards, still thrives and grows and raises questions against the religious establishment, against the interpretation of religious establishment. If you look at the two major issues, I would call them the two pillars of ideology in today's Islamic Republic. One is the enforcement of mandatory hijab on women as far as the domestic politics of the Islamic Republic is concerned. That is a major symbolic attempt by the state to try to prove its control over the society. And as far as the foreign policy is concerned, is basically rejection, anti-Westernism, more significantly the idea of United States as the great Satan. That is the foundation of the basically foreign policy of the Islamic Republic. These two, both in my view, are in the state of crisis, particularly as far as the domestic is concerned. As we have seen in the uprising 2 years ago, the protest movement, Zan Zindagi Azadi, Women, Freedom, and Life, that we witnessed emergence of a new generation of Iranians who are completely questioning the very basic ideology of the state, the very prescription of the idea of mandatory hijab. Mandatory hijab by itself seems to be a minor factor, except for the fact that it has a very symbolic presence. That's why we see there is so much emphasis that the idea of hijab should be implemented even by force in order to make sure that the authority of the state is not going to be undermined. This is a duality, this is the paradox that I don't think in near future we would be able to see an answer for it. But certainly we can see that how the development over the course of two and a half centuries ultimately brought them to this issue of resistance against modernity, resistance against accepting basic values of modernity. I would stop here. Thank you. Yes, please.
First of all, thank you for your wonderful lecture. Thank you for your great book on the modern history of Iran. I agree with your broad analysis, but I think there's 2 points I'd like to put on the table.
Of course, yes.
When it comes to the clerical establishment engaging with the problems of modernity and questions of politics, you sort of skirted over what I think is a major early development of things to come in modern Iran, and that's the constitutional revolution and the debates among the clerics in dealing with this issue of what does a secular constitution mean in a Muslim majority society like Iran. I'm talking about the very intense debates during the constitutional revolution between Ayatollah Naini and Ayatollah Nuri, who was, of course, executed because of his rejection of a secular constitution. But that creates, it's an indication of things to come. There was a lot of agitation there and engagement, if you read all of the great works of that period of time. But I think the bigger sort of gap that I see in your presentation is really the question of 20th century Iran under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and the question of imperialism, and the question of forced modernization, and this deep desire among the people of Iran for full self-determination that was seemingly robbed from them during the Mossadegh period, and the fact that the Shah was not only reinstated, but was so strongly supported by the United States. In other words, Iranians and other people in the Middle East, actually in the modern period, are motivated, in my reading, by the same impulse, the desire for self-determination from external intervention and occupation from foreign powers. So the story of Iran in that sense is not different from other countries, not just in the Middle East, but the global South. And in the case of Iran during the 20th century, it was so dramatically manifested by the heavy American presence, the 1953 coup, the overt sort of secularization and modernization policies that were being imposed on a very religious society, that then produces, as you get into the 60s and into the 70s, a deep crisis of legitimacy for the regime, and for many people who are saying, look, we're being governed by this dictator who's closely allied with the Americans. So the focus of, I think, intellectual thought and political agitation, which is then taken over by the clerics who champion this cause and rally people around this narrative. So I often tell my students, you can read some of Khomeini's speeches prior to the revolution. It's indistinguishable from Che Guevara in terms of the critique of foreign intervention, corruption, the exploitation of resources. So that's the enveloping context that I think you didn't address, that really, I think, shapes how Iranians were thinking in this period, which is why the clerics don't deal with the very important point you mentioned about the internal need to engage with modernity from an Islamic perspective, because that type of internal pushed aside because of the enveloping question of authoritarianism, Western support for the Shah, which is not just, I mean, we can't isolate the Shah from the broader politics of the global
Yes,
South
sure.
and what's happening in the Middle East,
Yes.
which actually is connected to the question of Palestine itself, because we're
Yes.
seeing this agitation happening again at this moment.
Yes.
And Iran can't be separated artificially from that broad sort of impulse and those types of intellectual debates that were shaping what Iranians were thinking during this period.
Okay.
Those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much for both comments. Am I allowed to respond right now? Okay. Well, both points are very well taken. As far as the constitutional revolution, you are right. There wasn't enough time for me to engage. I've written about it somewhat extensively, both in my Iran book and in other articles and other publications. Certainly it is true that the religious establishment made an attempt to try to come up with an answer to the issue of pluralism and the question of democracy. You refer to Naini with Tanbih al-Ummah, the famous work of his, was, as a matter of fact, very remarkable in the sense that he accepts the concept that in the absence of the Imam, I'm sure you are aware of that, absence of the 12th Imam, the legitimacy goes to the believers as a whole. And they, therefore, the institutions of democratic institutions and representatives of the people are legitimate. But I think you pointed out a very important issue. The fact is that Tanbih al-Ummah was, as a matter of fact, left aside by the religious establishment itself. That is Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, and he was not the only one. It was Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, and I counted at one count at least 70 mujtahids in provinces and in Najaf were supporting him. So in a sense, the attempt of creating what he referred to as mashru'a, that is a Shari'i constitution, a constitution that is based on Sharia, was already rejecting the idea of Naini. As it has been said, I don't know whether it's true or not, that by the end of the constitutional period, Naini himself was so disappointed with the outcomes of the constitution that he actually threw the text of Tanbih al-Ummah into the Euphrates. It's maybe just an anecdote. We don't know whether it's real or not. But nevertheless, he was very much in the minority. There are others who actually did write about how a constitutional regime could be very much a religious, agrees with religious basis. And as a matter of fact, if you know, the constitutionalists themselves made an enormous amount of effort to try to present the Constitution as a document or as a movement, and the Majlis as a movement, as a representative of it, as an Islamic institution, and something that it agrees with the Sharia. There was a whole point that we are only dealing with issues of the government, you are dealing with the issues of the Sharia, and there is no interference on our side in your affair. But that was not enough for the religious establishment, because they saw that there is a gradual loss of support for the religious establishment in favor of the new constitutional regime. So yes, it is true that if you want to go back and look at the origins of the way that the religious establishment felt isolated and felt out of the picture, we should go back to the constitutional revolution. But it was not because of the fact that they were actually barred from participation. And the whole spirit of the time, as you can see, many of the members of the clergy at that time shifted and became secular, or their children became secular. The Tabatabai family is a very good example of it. So in effect, you can see that there is a desire on the side of religious establishment not to address the issues of modernity, not to engage in, as you pointed out very rightly, in values of modern times. So they insisted that it should be definitely according to the Sharia. But Sharia did not provide them a Sharia that they were advocating. did not have the actual answer to the questions of the constitutional period, to the questions of legalization, of the codification of the law, to the fact that the human values and all individuals are equal in front of the secular law. If you look at the Lawaya, that was the publications of Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri from Qom during the period of his opposition to the constitutionalists in around 1907, you would clearly witness that how much he makes an attempt to, in a sense, to demonize the Constitution because it has foreign origins. And nobody can deny that the constitutionalists were looking to a model of constitution that comes from the outside. That's fine. I think there is no problem with that. I think that this was the need of the society, and this was how it has evolved, rather than going back to the Mashru'a model, which was already questioned and despised and could not carry the weight. As a matter of fact, you should also pay attention to this point, that we should pay attention to this point, that by 1908, 1909, even Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri abandoned the idea of Mashru'a and went back to the royalist camp and followed that old order of the sisterhood of the state and the religious establishment. And as a matter of fact, he was executed according to the committee's judgment, the revolutionary committee that came to power, because he had written a fatwa for the execution of a constitutionalist, not because of his opposition to the idea of the constitution. There is a slight difference. The second point is very well taken as well. I probably should have more emphasized the fact that the lack of political freedom or plurality under the latter years of the Pahlavi period, particularly from 1953 onwards, and more so from the 60s onward, certainly created a dictatorial model of government which allowed much of the opposition to be suppressed. We all know about this story. I need not to elaborate on that. The Sabak, the whole attempt to try to intimidate any voice of the opposition, secular, religious, any form of it. As a matter of fact, more unsecular than unreligious, as was the case. But I would not put as much of emphasis, as you pointed out, on the forces of imperialism. I think, yes, the Americans have a presence. I think, yes, Iran, during the Pahlavi period, felt that it is in the American camp. I think, yes, the Shah sometimes excessively gave voice to his counterparts, the American counterparts. But by and large, I don't think the Iranian society was, in a sense, colonized by imperial powers in the Pahlavi period. That's my interpretation. I'm sorry. I don't think that this was inevitable to change the system or to bring about reforms without a revolution. I think it could have been of course, as a historian, this is a counterfactual interpretation, but I would go that far and would say, yes, probably it would have been possible to gradually shift toward a more secular, liberal interpretation of reforms rather than the revolutionary path. The revolutionary path, as you know, I'm sure very well, has in many instances had a negative outcome. From the revolution of French Revolution that many historians now question the fact that whether it was a liberal revolution or not, all the way up to the Russian Revolution of 1917 onwards. Very few revolutions were indeed successful. Very few revolutions led to the creation of a liberal democracy. Perhaps Portugal is one example, perhaps a few others that we can count. But generally speaking, that is not the case. So I would say that basically the Khomeini and his supporters basically hijacked, and I don't want to use this term all the time, but in this context, because a historian would not believe in hijacking a revolution, but as a matter of fact, it could have taken a very different course towards a greater democracy that he denied because of his emphasis on the superimposition of an Islamic regime. That, I think, was the problem. And the Americans and their presence, by and large, I don't think was particularly harmful to Iran as Iran's independence. If you read much of the accounts of the Shah's, I'm not here in a place to actually talk about the diplomatic history, but you can see in many instances the regime in Iran, dictatorial as it was, it maintained a certain degree of independence from the Americans. You can see in many of the correspondence in the Kissinger period that I had the privilege to look at some of the private notes. You would see that indeed they were not completely servant or servile to the policies of the United States. There was a great degree of give and take. So I would say, yes, the forces of imperial domination over what you've said, the non-West societies, yes, it was very much present. But as a matter of fact, I would always think that that secular society that Iran had and still has, it was the product of the Pahlavi period. It's not the product of the Madrasa. It's not the product of that interpretation that Khomeini wanted to and wants to superimpose over the Iranian society. The secular society, yes, created a major rift in Iran by certain sectors of it accepting it, certain sectors of it rejecting it, as a matter of fact, but eventually they were the winners. And still, I think they are. 40 years after the Islamic Republic, despite all the social engineering that we witness happening under the Islamic Republic, they have not managed to create an Islamic society. Islamification failed. I was listening to the Minister of Islamic Guidance, Ershad, who was saying of the recent government, and he was saying, well, it is our task, this is 43 years after the revolution, he says, it is our task to Islamify the Iranian society. What does that tell you? It tells that it's still, there is a sense of insecurity, that this society is not secular, it is not Islamified enough. And there should be more. That's why hijab is so significant. I'm so sorry, yes. That was a kind of a long answer. I'm very sorry. Yes,
okay.
Please.
Abbas, so thank you very much for the overview, especially looking at, as you were saying, the social history and the institutions. I have actually two questions. One is when you were talking about the after the late 18th century and the integration of the religious scholars more into society, more into the state apparatus. How much is this also almost copycatting the Ottoman Empire and what has happened in the Ottoman Empire in this regard? Mm-hmm. And also, of course, the interplay and the opposition between the two big forces in the Middle East, the Safavids as well as the Ottomans at that point in time. And then when we go a little bit more into the 20th century, the question I would like to ask is how much of the Shi'i internationalism was there? And then I'm thinking particularly about the Lebanese Shi'is and their radicalization, which was not so much, I mean, to some extent it was from being left out of the state building of Lebanon, but also of just abject poverty and socioeconomic situation, and how much that plays then into the role and the response of the religious establishment in Iran.
Very nice. Both very important questions. The first one, I must confess that I don't have enough knowledge about the issue, that how much, in a sense, the Ottoman model of codification in Majalla and the state's power to try to redefine the Sharia was followed in Iran. There was a major difference. The Ottoman system, the clerical establishment were indeed the employees of the state. They were paid, they were basically controlled by the state. In the Iranian model, in the post-Safavid period, as they emerged, they were free agents. They were, of course, appointees. I mean, they are Imam Jum'as and Sheikhul Islams being appointed in various cities. These are the appointments of the government, but they were by no means the only voice of the religious establishment. The mujtahids, most of them independent mujtahids, had sometimes far greater power. Isfahan is a very great example of it. Hujjatul Islam, as he was referred to, Shafti, in the 19th century. There was an attempt on the side of Mushir al-Dawla, for instance, in the 1870s to try to create at least a sector of the religious law responsive to a certain degree of codification. It was by and large failed. So the religious establishment did not abide by that. The idea of creating a greater control over the religious establishment also failed. Under Nasruddin Shah, we would witness that one. Actually, the emergence of the Reji protest is a very good example of how they actually resisted any kind of an attempt by the state to try to bring them under a control of some sort. So 19th century, basically both the Qajars and the religious establishment agreed that there is no possibility for codification. As far as the 20th century, this is also a very important question, whether radicalization was the outcome of the Shi'i societies in other parts of the Muslim world, most significantly Lebanon, in the way that the Iranian movement moved towards the greater militancy, the Iranian establishment, religious establishment. Well, yes, true that there was a sense of discontent, but remember the famous religious figure of the 1970s, who was the founder of the Shi'i, his name escapes me this very moment. Imam Musa Sa'd, thank you very much. Imam Musa Sa'd was not he was an activist. He was not particularly in favor of an Islamic solution. He was, of course, in religious garb, but he was supported by the Pahlavi state. He believed that the Shiites should have a greater position within the system. And up to the very end and his assassination or whatever happened to him, disappearance, it was not necessarily his desire or his supporters, Amal movement also, desire to move further towards militancy. But it is true that from 80s onwards, particularly with the engagement with Israel, that when the Israelis attacked southern Lebanon or all the way up to Beirut, there was a greater degree of militancy that affected what happened in Iran as well. So I would not entirely, and also in Iraq as well. I mean, it's not only Lebanon. So yes, there is a sense of an international change in the Shi'i establishment or Shi'i clerical establishment. But I would say that still the greater force for radicalization comes through the Iranian part. Although, as I pointed out, the Muslim Brothers played a very important part in it. Translations of the works of Sayyid Qutb is of Mr. Khamenei, who was actually a translator of some of his works. So you would see that indeed the influence is very much present. But I don't think that the agenda of the Shi'i establishment was entirely that of the Muslim brothers. It was just influenced by that trend.
Salam, and thank you very much for your excellent presentation. Was that good enough? And it was a very hard subject to tackle in 1 hour, frankly. But I'm questioning your original question as why Madrasa turned radical, and also the proposition that Iranian dual system, meaning the kingship and mosque, mosque has been supportive throughout.
Yes.
My argument is somewhat different, and I'm arguing that the mosque and the palace, although had some good relation, especially at the time of Safavids, and then after Qajars took over, even Amanat Khan and Fatah Ali Shah claimed that they were mujtahid. And Fatah Ali Shah actually went to Ayatollah Kashif al-Ghita and asked him to bless his crony. And he said basically, you are giving me the power to be the king. That's Fatah Ali Shah. And so the relationship was, like that at some period of time. And then we will see that there's a period of time that there's a competition between the two. And the kings of Qajar are trying to stave off the mosque. And, but they are always ready to assert their power. And then we will see...
You mean the Qajars?
During the Qajar period,
Yes.
and after they were pretty well suppressed by Reza Shah and reducing their power, then again at the time of the Second Pahlavi, we would see the rise of their widespread power to the point that Falsafi ordered Shah to destroy Haziratul Quds of Baha'is, and he immediately followed through.
Yeah.
Which was an unbelievable act by a secular king. But he did.
Yes.
Now, this relationship was amazing, but the quantitative measure also is important. When Reza Shah passed, or gave the crown or throne to his son, there was only 400 mosques in Iran, because he had forbidden this widespread mosque business. When Muhammad Reza Shah was abdicated, he left 50,000 mosques.
Maybe so, yes.
50,000 mosques. And all of these Ayatollahs and Akhunds and all that, thousands of them. And the quantitative factor is important too.
Yes.
Now, what I'm trying to say is, it is not that they were supportive and then they became radical. They were always the rival of the state. And when they found the weakness in the state, they took over. Simple like that.
Well,
and Shah was sick. Shah was, Shah had cancer. Shah had lost control. And they sensed that. They came forward.
Well, thank you very much. Let me respond to both the points that you've made. First, about the Qajar period. Yes, it is true. The age of Fatah Ali Shah was indeed the golden age of the ijtihad, mujtahid, so as I've said and described in my book. And yes, the Qajars very in search of legitimacy, and because as you might know, after the collapse of the Safavids, close to 70 years, there was a crisis of legitimacy. No one could replace the Safavids as a sacred state as they presented themselves for 2 centuries, more than 2 centuries. So, yes, it is true that much homage was paid to the religious establishment. They were invited from Atabat to come back to Iran. They were given enormous amount of gifts and endowments in various parts of the country. And Fath Ali Shah was, in a sense, very, in my opinion, very cleverly managed to handle the religious establishment by doing so. But by no means I think that he based his authority purely on Shiism. As you know, the age of Fath Ali Shah is the beginning of the idea of imperial Iran. I mean, all of the symbolism appears in the paintings and so forth is the creation of an imperial system in which the clergy plays a part. I'm not sure about whether I've seen that interaction between Kashf al-Ghita and Fath Ali Shah. If you give me the source, I would be happy to see what was the Yes, of course. So I don't think I would question that. This was the period that they thrived, and they came out of the madrasas, and they managed to, for quite a while, to indeed maintain and wither much of the opposition to them. The Babi movement in the 1840s is a major challenge to the religious establishment. They managed to eventually contain it with the help of the state. So that is where you can see the interaction between the state and the religious establishment. That's the time when the state somewhat unwillingly interferes on their behalf in order to contain the Babi movement and in order to allow them to survive as a community. There was a huge amount of threat to them in the 1840s and 50s. As far as the contention between them, I tend to agree with you as well. As I said, much of it is not on the question of legitimacy. It's on the question of as I said, the turf war. It was basically on the vested interests of the religious establishment versus the state, influence and registering their presence in the society. That is what they wanted to achieve, rather than questioning the very presence of the Qajar state. And that I haven't seen any document that a mujtahid would question before the middle of the 20th century, even at the time of the regime protest. Perhaps the only example that we see a very strong reaction to the Qajars is Agha Najafi in Isfahan, that he declares that there is a Hukumat Islami. That's the first time that we hear among the clergy the reference to Hukumat Islami, the Islamic government. So, to make it rather short, it is also true that in the post-Second World War, there was a need for the state to try to attract the support of the clergy. The case of the Baha'is that you mentioned, first of all, Burujerdi himself played a very important part in this process. It wasn't only Falsafi. Falsafi was the voice of the religious establishment, but really it came from Burujerdi. And as a matter of fact, it could have resulted in the elimination of the Baha'i community in Iran if it was not because of interference of international community, because of a lot of protests that was made in order to contain it, and the Shah was eventually forced to contain it. Yes, that's again another example of this kind of a contention, but not necessarily rejection of the religious establishment. That is a very different trend from what emerged under Khomeini in the 1960s, more so in the 1970s. Because in the earlier stages, Khomeini even was saying that I'm giving counsel to the Shah, nasihat mikonam. So it was not the rejection of the monarchy altogether, but of course gradually turned in that direction, in my opinion, as more and more the rhetoric of the left was absorbed by the religious establishment. I'm at the end of it. Thank you.
Just one second question from a student.
By all means, yes, Danny.
Please also.
یک دقیقه.
Sorry, whoa. I have a really quick question from like a student perspective. I feel like as a historian, it's really interesting to hear about different parts of the world as being combinations of people who are social, have culture, speak different languages, are diverse, religion, whatever that looks like. But in your perspective, what is an aspect of history you wish people looked at more? What is an aspect of history you think is overlooked and that people you wish considered more, whether that be in the classroom or in general?
It's a very difficult question for a historian to answer. I would say that probably the issue of the development of the religious establishment, the way that it evolved over a period of time, still requires more attention. As I've indeed tried to give you a sketch of that picture. But I would say there are much more in the 20th century history that remains still not fully addressed. Even the Pahlavi period, the late Pahlavi period remains to be further explored. And largely is because of the sources. The historians are slave of the sources. If the sources are not there, it's difficult to discuss it. And more the sources are now becoming available. Thank you.
On behalf of Persian Studies program, my colleagues, my students, undergrad and graduate students, it was an honor to have you here. Thank you so very much, and thank you also to what the Sheikh Islamic found that without, it was kind of impossible.
Yes.
To have you. Thank you very much for
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.